Great. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome on behalf of the National Lawyers Guild UO chapter to the annual WAMI 2023 keynote lecture. Thank you for being here. And a big thank you to the Radical Organizing and Activism Resource Center and Outlaws for helping make this event happen. It's very exciting for us. There are some snacks in the back, and if you enjoy a drink in a can, please put it in our little recycling box right next to the drinks. That would be awesome. We'd like to begin the evening with a land acknowledgement. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. We express our respect for all federally recognized tribal nations of Oregon. This includes the Burns Paiute tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquille Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes. We also express our respect for all other displaced Indigenous peoples who call this place that we call Oregon home. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of the Atlanta Forest Defenders with the following statement. NLG at Oregon Law would like to express our solidarity with the forest defenders fighting against the construction of Cop City in Atlanta. Law enforcement detained at least 35 people in Atlanta on Sunday, March 5th at a Solidarity Music Festival over a mile away from the Cop City construction site. Among those arrested was an NLG legal observer. All of these arrests are part of ongoing state repression and violence against racial and environmental justice protesters who are fighting to defend their communities from the harms of militarized policing and environmental degradation on stolen Muskogee land. Each of these instances, including the many protesters charged with domestic terrorism, makes clear that law enforcement views movement activists as enemies of the state. The destruction of the Wilani Forest will undoubtedly exacerbate the climate crisis and expand the policing of Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color in Atlanta. NLG firmly condemns arrests of any protesters, including medics, jail support, and legal observers. We are proud to contribute in whatever ways we can to advance the critical work of our movement allies advocating for liberation and community care. NLG remains in solidarity with the movement to stop Cop City. Now, allow me to introduce our incredible speaker. We are thrilled to have with us this evening author, activist, and disruptor, Andrea Ritchie. Andrea is a Black lesbian immigrant survivor and has spent the past 3 decades documenting, organizing, advocating, litigating, and agitating around policing and criminalization of Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people. Her work and influence in the movement for abolition spans from the courtroom to grassroots organizations to the halls of the United Nations. Currently, she hosts the Invest Divest learning communities at the Community Resource Hub and supports dozens of organizations across the United States to divest from policing and invest in community safety. She's here with us today to discuss the themes and ideas in her and Miriam Kaba's new book and the NLG Book of the Year, No More Police, A Case for Abolition. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Ritchie.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm so honored to be here with all of you today. I'm a proud NLG member since law school graduation or before. And one of the first things I did when I got out of law school was be a legal observer for the National Lawyers Guild during the 2004 Republican National Convention in New York City, which was, a week of mass arrests, mass protest, mass resistance, and then mass litigation. So definitely, I'm proud to be here. It makes me so proud, and Mariam as well, that No More Police has been chosen as the book of the year for the Guild, and we're thrilled because we wrote this book for you, and so the fact that you all want to read it together and talk about it makes us really happy. So thank you for that. For folks who can't perceive me, I'm a very light-skinned Black woman with curly hair, and I think I have burgundy glasses on today and a turtleneck, and I'm sitting in a living room in California. So I wanted to also do an acknowledgement of the people whose lands I sit on, the Gabrielino and Tongva people, who are traditional caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands and the indigenous peoples in this place, and pay my respects to the ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging on this land. So with that, I will jump into sharing some thoughts and themes from No More Police. And I know we want to leave a lot of time for questions because I want to hear what you all are thinking. And what are questions that you all have? Are you hearing me okay? Is everything all right? Oh, I can't hear you.
Yes, I am hearing you okay. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out this camera situation so you can see the room.
Oh,
and
I
not
see.
this blank wall.
Yeah.
Also, a note on questions. We have slips of paper for y'all in the audience to write down your questions as they come up, and we will read them to Andrea at the end of the talk. And also, Zoom folks, you can send chats to the host with your questions. So sorry for that interruption.
Not at all.
Continue.
I was glad. I didn't want to be speaking to myself because this room has heard it all before. All right. So I wanted to jump in the conversation and invite you all where we start the book, which is asking the question, of the reader and of people engaging the book, when the first time was that you first questioned the violence of policing. And so I invite you all to think about that. For many folks, it was the murder on camera of George Floyd in 2020. For some folks, it was the killing of Mike Brown, or the killing of Trayvon Martin, or the killing of Oscar Grant by BART police in 2000. And then, for others of us, it was Amadou Diallo in 1999, or it was the beating of Rodney King in 1991. So I think it's really generational, but sometimes it's about a particular instance, a particularly spectacular, a particularly untenable, unbearable, inconceivable, unconscionable instance of police violence. And then also you'll notice all the names that I just said are names of men that, and this is a huge part of the work that I've done over the time that I've been working on issues of policing, is really say that for each of those stories, there's as many, if not more, stories of women who experienced police violence, whether it was Taisha Miller and LaTanya Haggerty, who were killed at the same time as Amadou Diallo, whether it was Sandra Bland, who was killed around the same time as Mike Brown, or Michelle Cusseau, who was a Black lesbian who was killed in Phoenix literally 2 days after Mike Brown, but whose story didn't shape national resistance in the same ways, or whether it was Corinne Gaines, or whether it was Maya Hall, or Kayla Moore, or any number of other names I can list for you that are stories of Black women, girls, and trans people who were killed by police, often in very similar circumstances as those involving men, sometimes in much more gender-specific circumstances. And of course, in 2020, for a lot of people, Breonna Taylor was the name that opened up the notion that Black women are killed by police as well. So, oh great, I can see you all. Look at you all. I think I've been in that actual room before, if I'm not mistaken. But it's great to be back. Zooming in. So sometimes it's a spectacular moment of violence like that, and sometimes it's seeing someone that you know and love be criminalized, someone in your community be criminalized. Sometimes it's not a killing, sometimes it's a beating, sometimes it's just being stopped and frisked, and I say just not in the sense that that's any less of an issue, but something that is less something that's talked about in the same way. And sometimes it's your own experience of policing or lack of protection. Sometimes it's when you called the cops for help and they weren't helpful, or worse yet, when they showed up, they came for you. So for some of us, it's our own experiences of policing or our family members, and sometimes it's not so spectacular. It's the day-to-day grind of being stopped by cops so many times on the way to school that you're always late, and then getting a ticket for being late, and then being behind in your class, and then being expelled and suspended, and then being stopped and frisked on your way home, and then repeat every single day. So that we wanted to invite people into the conversation by thinking, when was the first time that you were like, this is a lot, this is not producing safety, this is a lot of violence. And the other way that we invited people into the conversation was by asking folks how they would describe police or policing in a single sentence. And so we made some posters that you can see social media graphics of on our website at Interrupting Criminalization, the organization I co-founded with Mariam Kaba. But we just asked people who we knew or who we'd been in conversation with around the book, sort of say what police are in one sentence. So I said, police are violence, not safety. Mariam said, police defends the system, capitalism, that generates what then gets labeled as crime. Policing is the armed protection of state interests. Rachel Hertzing, who's a teacher and longtime comrade of mine, said, policing is the protracted death of captive life, according to Eric Stanley, who wrote Atmospheres of Trans Violence, which you shall read, or Atmospheres of Violence, right? Policing is the opposite of safety. Safety is negation. Is something that Robin Maynard, who wrote a book about policing in Canada called Policing Black Lives, which you should also read. And in the book, we said police exist to enforce existing relations of power and property, period. So we just wanted people to sort of think about what police are and what policing is as a function. So for instance, policing is a deadly failure of the imagination. The notion that all we can think of as the predominant response to every form of conflict, harm, and need is police, police, and more police. We're not using our imaginations. Policing is not law's absence, it's law's essence in assistance of racial capitalism. In other words, we're not, that policing and law are the same thing, and that they both are in service of racial capitalism, and so on. So we wanted folks to think about when they first kind of entered this conversation about the violence of policing, and then what they think policing actually is. And, we called No More Police a case for abolition because, the origin of the book was that when the demand to defund police was first made on a national stage in ways that people were picking up, it wasn't the first time it was made by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the Black Panthers made a demand to defund the police, and many people in between have done that. But as it hit the national stage in the kind of way that it did in 2020, people were sort of trying to reinterpret it and be like, well, they don't really mean get rid of them completely. They just mean, if everybody else's budget's cut, then maybe we should cut the police budget a little bit too. And, they just mean they shouldn't do this, but they should still do that. And so Mariam wrote an op-ed saying, yes, we really do want to abolish the police. And it was in the New York Times. And people asked for something that sort of really fleshed the case that she started to make out in that op-ed that many abolitionists, including many folks who work with critical resistance, many folks in the Guild have been making for decades. And so we just thought we would actually just make a case, like we were making an argument, like we were filing a brief. And so I have for you a 400-page brief with a really nice cover. And that's what we set out to do. So there's 3 elements of our case. The police don't promote safety, they prevent it, and that we can't fix that. The violence of policing cannot be reformed because police are violence. And the third element of the case, I think, is actually the key, is that we can create safety without policing, and that we need to understand that we have been conditioned and our imaginations have been captured to equate policing and safety, which is why we're so much trying to fix them all the time, when in fact, there are so many ways, an infinity of ways that we create safety without police, and that we want to lean into and get into that. So I think the thing that also feels important to share about the book is, I think, and this is to the theme of your conference and some of the ways that we talk about these issues, we talk about ending mass incarceration. Does that mean that there's a just right amount of incarceration? We talk about, over policing and over criminalization. Do we believe that there's a just right amount of policing, a just right amount of criminalization? Is there what Mariam, I think, sometimes calls the Goldilocks approach? Are we just trying to find the right amount? And I think the answer for us is absolutely not. There's the issue is policing and criminalization and incarceration itself. And so we don't want to focus on just the volume of it. We want to focus on the fact of it. And for us, when we're not just seeking to kind of shrink the system as it is, but we're seeking to get rid of it altogether. But that also means that we need to get rid of all the systems of power and structures of power that produce and require it, and that policing makes possible and manufactures and enforces. So for us, it's not just about shrinking the prison population or police budgets, or taking some functions out of the police hands, or decriminalizing some things like drug use, but it's about dismantling the systems of power that have shaped our world and changing entirely the ways that we understand the world and relate to each other, and how we understand what safety is and isn't and how we produce it, and then building structures to meet our individual and collective needs and make sure that we're preventing and interrupting harm as well as healing from it, rather than just intervening with policing and punishment. So it's a big project. It's not a small task. And so we start, as I said, the first element of the case being cops don't stop violence. And we cite a wealth of resources. Much of the research we cite is actually research by law enforcement. Some of it comes from a textbook from a class I taught on policing. And they know it doesn't work because it's their research that shows it doesn't matter how many cops there are. It doesn't matter how fast they respond. It doesn't matter where they patrol. It doesn't matter how they do it. They have no measurable impact on violence. They have measurable impact on crime sometimes, but that's because they are the ones who decide what counts as crime, and they're the ones who collect the statistics on it, and they're the ones who publicize the statistics on it, and no one is checking them on it. They tell you how many homicides there are. None of us are actually going to the coroner's office and counting up and making sure that the number of homicides that they say have happened. They have been shown multiple times to game the crime numbers to suit their interests. In LA, in New York, in many cities, it's been uncovered that cops are either downcharging things or counting things as a lower rate. So for instance, as you all know, being in law school, an assault can be charged as a assault in many different degrees, or it can be charged as a robbery, or it could be charged as a terrorist act, depending on how you charge it. And cops will investigate it as a lower rate of crime when they need crimes to go down, and they will bring down the sexual assault stats by saying that, they couldn't solve it because the person wouldn't come forward. And they will raise those crime rates when they need to raise them as well, by charging things higher, by keeping cases open longer, etc. So we go into great detail about that in the book, and talk about this question of who makes crime stats, and how crime and violence and homicide all get conflated when in fact, as you all know very well, they're all very different things. And also that what society decides is or isn't a crime is very much a political process. And so, at one time doing coke in public was not a crime. And it very much became a crime for very politicized reasons around criminalizing Black people. There was a time when certain things were not, and then they were criminalized, and littering, for instance, or, prostitution. There was a very intentional decision to criminalize prostitution at a time when it made political sense to do so. And then even once something that you would say, okay, well, sure, those things maybe, but killing someone, that's always been a crime, right? Well, it depends who does it and under what circumstances. As you know, a president can go, send a drone to Yemen and assassinate someone, and no one even thinks about thinking that's a crime. They're like, that's an act of, political patriotism. And cops can kill people all the time and it not be a crime. And some people can kill people in self-defense and it isn't. And some people can kill in self-defense and it is. So we're looking at the notion of crime through all of those lenses around the political and social determinants that make that determination. And then also we're looking at the fact that the cops are the ones who are collecting the information and then saying crime is up. Well, they're not saying like littering is up, and littering is up because now we're enforcing littering more often and we're going into certain neighborhoods to enforce it. And that's how we're generating more crime. And then crime is down. Well, maybe we're just not doing that, or we're doing it somewhere else. You know, it's everything about that conversation is in the control of the cops. And often crime and homicide are loosely played with each other, and then, you know, violence, not all violence is criminalized. Wage theft, economic violence, police violence, a lot of it is not criminalized. So there's this whole kind of conflation of crime, violence, and harm and homicide that the cops play fast and loose with. But across the board, the research shows that they actually don't have an impact on any of it, except for crime, because they can manipulate that through their own actions and through their own numbers. And this is no accident, because we just looked at what policing is. If policing is about maintaining an existing order, then that's what the actions of cops are going to be doing. And it's not about trying to actually protect people, and certainly not people who are on the wrong side of those structures of violence and economic systems and political systems. So they're doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. What they're doing in Cop City is exactly what they were set up to do, which is to protect the interests of corporations and capital. And corporations and capital are paying for what Cop City so that they can train the cops to defend their interests in urban warfare techniques. And that's why they're going so hard against people who are protesting against it, because they want to be able to continue to do what they were set up to do. The important thing about this too is that there's research that shows what does stop violence. So even if you believe that cops stop violence, there's also research showing that there's other ways of stopping violence without the violence of policing. And that's the thing that's also critical about this conversation, is that it's framed as an on-off switch. It's like cops or no cops, more or less cops. Those are the only two options we have. And we're not thinking about studies that show that for every 10 or 100 additional community organizations, homicide rates go down by 10%. So if we just had, 1,000 more community organizations, we could decrease homicide rates by the amounts that cops say, defund caused them to go up or whatever, which is no cops were defunded, and there's no relationship between violence going up and numbers of police going down. So it's a really important thing to pick apart this case that one, police are necessary to stop violence. The research shows they don't. Two, that there's no other way to stop violence because the research shows there is. And then, three, that we should rely on the statistics that are given by the people in whose interests they serve to make those kinds of determinations. So that's what's in that chapter. In the second chapter, we go kind of to this next level of cops not stopping violence, because people are always like, okay, Andrea, sure, cops only solve a quarter of murders. And, by solve, they mean they maybe identify who the person is. And does it stop the next thing, the next problem? No, but still, we need them, because what about rape? What about domestic violence? What about gender-based violence? What about gun violence? Like, we need police to deal with these things. And the important thing to know is that the people who are in the leadership of organizations and movements to defund and abolish police are survivors of violence. We have a chapter called We Are Survivors, because both of us are, and so is almost everyone else we know who's engaged in this movement. And the reason that most of us are survivors is because for us, the police did not produce safety. It did not lead to safety. And that is true for the vast majority of survivors. 75% of people who are sexually assaulted never call the police. Almost half of people who experience domestic violence never call the police. And there's a multitude of reasons for that in terms of what happens when the police do show up, which is nothing or more harm, or it interrupts the violence temporarily, but not permanently. And then things get actually worse. because police are not equipped to deal with these kinds of very violence that's rooted in complicated systems of oppression and complicated dynamics in interpersonal relationships. And because also they show up after the fact, after the harm's already done. And what we want is more and better for ourselves and the other 75% of people who aren't benefiting from the thing that is benefiting from all the investment in society. So we are abolitionists because we want more safety for ourselves and our communities, and we're constantly thinking about what we could do better, because we can do better than this with $100 billion. And so we really want to think about what that might look like and how we get the resources available to build safety. And to be honest, every survivor of any kind of violence will tell you that one of the things that was really important to them was having housing, safe housing, a place where they could be safe. That so much of unsafety happens because of insecure housing, or being forced to live with someone who is not safe for you, or to stay in families that are not safe, or to live in a place where you're not safe because people around you are unsafe. And housing is like the number one thing that we could be doing instead of policing to increase safety. Healthcare, immigration status, employment. There's a whole bunch of things that people name that are about increasing their self-determination, agency, options, and resources that actually are much more effective at decreasing violence, or interrupting violence, or letting people escape violence or heal from violence. So the second element of the kind of cops don't stop violence is that the people who want something different are the people who are most experiencing the violence. So more on that in chapter 2. The last thing I'll say before I move on is also police are violence, as the posters pointed out, and that's true of gender-based violence as well, that cops are engaged in sexual violence, including when responding to calls for help around violence. And so, and there's statistics to bear this out, that 70% of police sexual violence involves victims of violence, young people, people who are stopped for traffic offenses or in need of assistance for traffic issues. They're witnesses in cases. They're people who are vulnerable and need help, and the police come in contact with them and abuse their power and extort or force sex onto them in those situations. And so it's not just, what about how do we deal with violence when we know there's other ways of dealing with it, but also when we invest money in cops, we're investing in more violence, in high rates of sexual violence and high rates of domestic violence among police officers. So, as I said, the third chapter is then, can't we fix it? And Mariam really felt like it was essential to spell reform in this way, because really what we are doing when we're trying to fix policing is we're just reforming it, something that into a new shape that's the same thing. And there's been, we trace at the beginning of the chapter, hundreds of years of reform efforts. The blue ribbon task forces and commissions and investigations and all of these things that for hundreds of years, from the early 1800s until the present, have been making very similar recommendations for reform, and none of them have, it just continues. It's George Floyd, and then it's Breonna Taylor, and then it's Tyree Nichols, and then it's Tortuguita, and it's never ending. And in each case, it becomes more and more apparent that the cops who killed Tyree Nichols were wearing the body cameras that we said would fix it after the cops killed Mike Brown. And, the cops killed George Floyd after they had adopted all these reforms that we said would fix it after the cops killed Eric Garner. And it's just, it doesn't work, clearly. And there's a reason for that, right? That's why we start with, what is policing? Policing is what policing is doing. And so that there's no way of reforming it. But when we try to, we legitimize policing as a solution to social problems that they themselves are producing. We legitimize the notion that it's possible to get a just right amount of policing, or a just right kind of policing. And that has us throwing more money and more legitimacy and more power to them in an effort to get them to be better. And that has shielded and fueled ongoing violence. it's given us the illusion that something's changed, and then the next day we wake up and we see another spectacular or less spectacular daily form of violence continuing, while continuing to give cops more and more resources and power under the pretext of addressing the problem. And so we describe it actually in No More Police as kind of a protection racket, as the state coming to you and saying, we need police to be safe, give us all the money to create more police. And then the police come and say, oh, actually violence is up, we need more money. And so we take more money and put it into police. And they say like, oh, we need more money. And we need, oh, you don't like what we're doing, we need more money to fix ourselves. And it's just a constant extraction of resources from our communities in order to give the illusion of fixing the problem when in fact things are staying the same. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't try things along the way to abolition. We're not going from, 18,000 law enforcement agencies employing hundreds of thousands of cops in this country to none overnight. We're going to get there, and it's unrealistic to think that we're going to do it overnight. And so it's not like all change that's not full abolition is not worth pursuing. We have to build steps towards abolition, but we have to do it wisely, and we have to do it using transformative demands. And those are that demands that center people and what we need to increase safety and well-being in communities, that don't presume that the cops will always be there. And they have to be things that, and so an example of something that presumes the cops will always be there is civilian oversight. We're going to build something that's going to watch the cops better. That presumes the cops are always going to be there. And we're not actually centering the people who need more safety in that situation. We're just putting more money into something else associated with policing as an example of that. Demands that are transformative are those that chip away at those systems of harm and promote new systems. So they say, no cops in traffic enforcement. And how can we build safety on our streets without having someone else do basically the same thing that cops are doing? Charging people tickets they can't pay, trying to catch them doing something to put them into some kind of consequence, even if it's the cops. How do we actually promote new systems that reflect the society we want to build? We want to build a society where people are cared for, are safe, have what they need, and feel responsible and accountable to each other, and where violence is not possible, but when it happens anyway, we have all the tools available to us to interrupt it, to prevent it, to transform it. So if you're trying to figure out, well, that sounds kind of vague, Andrea, we made a little binder for y'all that helps decide whether it's a reform that's going to reform police into a new thing, or is it something that is going to be a transformative demand that brings us closer to the world that we want. And so you can check it out. It's on our website, and it at interruptingcriminalization.com. And there's some basic principles for how you decide if it's actually an abolitionist proposal or strategy. And then there's some in each category, whether it's policing, detention or imprisonment, courts and prosecution. If you're thinking about, electoral candidates and their positions on these issues, there's some tools for evaluating that. If you're thinking about public health, there's some tools there, and about getting cops out of schools. And then now increasingly, as we're thinking through increasing criminalization of sexual and reproductive care, how do we make sure that we're not advancing that, and that we're actually deconstructing that and not creating conditions where that's more likely than less. So these are some of the questions that are the overarching principles that we want to think about when we're evaluating a reform. And then as you go into the document itself, there are charts and graphs, which are some of my favorite things. And, it's almost like an outline. So hopefully it's useful to folks whose brains are structured like mine, boxes, rules, etc., checklists. So be sure to check that out. So they don't stop violence. Survivors want this system to end. We can do that in steps. We need to make sure we're clear about the steps that we're taking. The other thing we need to be clear about is that we're not recreating police in new forms, or we're not moving our power, money, and legitimacy and resources from the actual cops to an institution that has people who act like cops. And that's almost all institutions of a carceral state. So that feels really important when we're thinking about quote unquote alternatives to police. And the reason I say quote unquote alternatives is because, again, this was something that Mariam really pushed hard on at the beginning of the pandemic, or sorry, the beginning of the uprising, when this talk about alternatives to police kept, coming up. What's your alternative? Or people were like, we have an alternative, or that became the topic of conversation. And the thing about naming something as an alternative to police, what stays in your brain is police. And what you are trying to create is something that looks like police, but isn't quite police. So maybe they're just wearing different uniforms. Maybe they're riding bikes instead of driving patrol cars. Maybe they're called traffic enforcement officers, but they're basically still going to Black neighborhoods and ticketing, people for, whatever, unmarked license plates, too much tint on the windows, whatever it is that's happening that's about targeting particular populations for criminalization. And also, there are other professions that play policing roles. So often we say things like treatment, not punishment. Well, sometimes the treatment is punishment. Coerced medical intervention is carceral. I've talked to people who have been in mental health crisis and said, I can't tell sometimes whether it's the cops who pick me up or the EMTs. I guess the hospital room, like the sheets are slightly nicer, but it feels basically like a cell, and I'm trapped in there for 72 hours or until I can convince someone that I should be let out. And that's just a different kind of policing. We hear people say things like counselors, not cops, but counselors are cops in some situations, particularly in the family policing system where they can promote and facilitate family separation. Without for poverty, basically 90% of the cases of child removal are for conditions that are essentially related to poverty, and they're doing so in ways that involve home searches, strip searches, warrantless searches of houses, interrogations, and sometimes police violence and police killings. And so, is that system really not police? And then counselors, not cops in schools. I mean, we know counselors are responsible for tracking, for suspensions, for expulsions, for things that are actually not supportive. And there's many other instances where that's the case. Sometimes we'll say for prostitution related offenses, we should have folks go to counseling instead of go to jail. But I mean, if you're trading sex because you need a place to live, the counseling's not really going to help you. Like, wait, people are like, actually, what I need is, are you going to give me housing? Because otherwise, then we're wasting our time here in conversation. So we really want to think about how we approach this idea of what we want instead, and or what we want to create, period. We want to start from the place of like, what makes our communities safer, and then go from there and be careful that we're not replicating cops in a new form. So we have some tools for that as well. At Interrupting Criminalization, there's, for instance, a guide we put together on, I guess we said alternative mental health responses because that's what the world was calling them, but they're really about building a coordinated crisis response in your community, whatever that looks like for you. And then it's not going to look the same everywhere. You all live in the place where there's a program called Cahoots, where everybody's like, that's the model, but that's actually the model for Eugene, Oregon, right? It's the model where there's a Whitebird Clinic, and where the Whitebird Clinic has built this kind of particular relationship where actually they're able to not do a lot of calls with the cops, and they're able to figure out, how to be in relationship with other organizations and create a particular kind of response. That's not going to be the case everywhere. We can learn from Cahoots. We're grateful for Cahoots for all the lessons they've learned over the years and are sharing. And it's not going to be Cahoots everywhere. And we have to take the lessons and build something where we are. And we have to think about every step of the way, what's going to happen. If we're, for instance, trying to get a crisis response where where 911 is the number you still call, then, well, do the cops control 911, or are they still listening in on the calls? Are they going to show up at the calls even if the non-police crisis response is dispatched? Are they going to respond with the social worker? Who has control in those situations? Who's the boss? Who gets to decide what happens? All these questions are really important when we're thinking about building a response outside police, how police will try and get in, stay in, or can still be engaged in the same kind of criminalizing behavior through the program. So making sure that we recognize what cops are, that we recognize that they can't be reformed, and that we recognize that we don't want to recreate cops in new forms, really requires us to get into our own brains and hearts about what policing is and what safety is. And so we talk in this chapter about, safety is not a product that you can be sold. It's whether by the carceral state or by private security. And it's never 100%. Safety is, we are human beings living in a dangerous universe and, under dangerous conditions. There's no guarantee that lightning won't strike the building that you're in right now, that the big earthquake won't arrive, that, many other things could happen, and we can't ever be perfectly safe. What safety is the relationship. It is a relationship to resources and to community and to the world around you. And so the question is, how do we shape those relationships? How do we build the skills in our relationships with other humans that will interrupt and prevent and heal harm? How do we change people's relationships to resources so that people don't engage in certain behavior because their needs aren't being met? How do we change our relationship to the world around us such that, the likelihood of cataclysmic climate catastrophe is somewhat diminished, right? Like, that's actually what we need to think about. We're not taught to think about that because of propaganda, and we need to look for where propaganda is in the world. It's certainly on Law and Order SVU, which I watched religiously in law school because I felt like it was a good way to study, because what they do is often not actually legal, or they're lying about the law often. But that tells you that cops are the answer. And then there's also literature that says that, and there's films, and there's music, and there's, even, some of my favorite songs refer to police or policing. And so we have to really think about how to unseat cops from our imaginations as the solution, and more as part of the problem that we're trying to get rid of. And then there's definitely, if we're thinking about getting rid of policing in all its forms and reimagining how we think about safety, which means thinking about how we're in relationship with each other and resources in the world around us, then we get to the place where, like, how are we structuring our society exactly? And then, is it possible to have a state that's not in some way carceral? Is it possible to have a state that isn't policing who's in and who's out at a border? Is it possible to have a state that isn't policing who's good and who's bad in how they're distributing resources? Who doesn't say, you can get social assistance, but only if you have less than this number of children, or only if you've gotten it and haven't gotten it before, or only if, whatever, any other number of conditions that come on social entitlements, right? That basically take the form of policing. So is it possible to have a state that doesn't have policing either in its disciplinary functions, forcing people to pay taxes, forcing people to behave in certain ways, or in its distribution functions? And if so, then great, how do we build that? And if not, then what are we building instead? And then in the meantime, what are we doing to create the conditions for what we want to emerge? So we don't have the answers to these questions. We just know how to pose them and some thoughts about them. So we invited folks to engage them themselves in this zine discussion tool, Abolition and the State, and you can find it also on our website. And it just invites you to be in reflection and conversation with yourself and others about these questions and what they mean for the kind of work that you do, and the kinds of demands that you make, and the kinds of things that you're practicing in your community. So invite you to check that out. And, it could be a great project or thought. I mean, part of the way this came to us was, I think I had to do an exercise at one point to design a legal system for Wakanda, right? To just be like, okay, it's Wakanda, it's Black liberation, we control everything. Now, what's our legal system? And, very quickly we came to this question of like, it's all about the vibranium. And we had to figure out how to distribute that. And then here came the policing, right? And we thought about policing, with fabulous costumes and super cool, but like it was still policing. So I think that we really just want to be in these imagination exercises to think about the role of the state in our futures. So there's some frameworks that are offered in there about maybe we don't have to decide. We can try all three at once or different strategies, or as long as they're in communication with each other, et cetera. But you'll see it when you go to the site. And that's what we mean by a dual power approach, which is that we fight the state for the things we need, like all the resources it's extracted from us and all the power and legitimacy it has. And we build the things that we need over here. And we do those two things in relationship with each other. So the question is, what are we building over here? What are we experimenting with outside the state that could give us clues as to what new forms of governance and social and economic relations could look like that can then shape how we're trying to build the world without policing. So, but the key here is experiment. It's not sitting around and talking about it and thinking about it and waiting to come with the perfect idea that we'll then share with everyone. I know with lawyers, we always want to get to the point where we have the perfect answer. No, we're just going to get messy. We're going to be like, whatever we're doing, we can do better than this. We can do better than what's currently happening. And let's try something. Let's try it with rigor and discipline. Experiments not just all over the place. You set a hypothesis. You decide how you're going to test it. You set conditions. You try and make sure nobody gets hurt while the experiment is happening. And then figure out how to move forward. And that is, and then once you've done your experiment, you look at the results, you assess, you decide if you're going to run the experiment again or run a different experiment. And that is, I think, the way we need to be thinking about how we create safer communities. And I invite you all to check out the Million Experiments website that shows you how people are experimenting now. Lastly, I just wanted folks to really understand that all of what you just heard comes from not just my experience, certainly as a survivor of police violence, as the daughter of a survivor of violence, and as a migrant, as a Black woman, as a lesbian, as a person who's part of many communities that have experienced policing and continue to experience policing and police violence. But it's also rooted in Black feminist politics and practice. And that means that, one, I need to dismantle every system of oppression operating in Black women, queer, and trans people's lives. And certainly the people who enforce those systems of oppression, which the police are foot shoulders of those systems, but also that I need to build a society that's based on a radical practice of care and collectivity, and that do that internationally. And so that ultimately is a wholesale transformation of the world. So it's really a revolutionary prospect. So we conclude the book by asking all of you, how you will practice Black feminist abolition dreams today. And there's many tools out there to start. There's certainly defundpolice.org. You can learn about people working to defund police around the country. You can learn about people who are experimenting with community safety strategies at millionexperiments.com. You can think about, and this is particularly relevant for y'all, that we did a whole website on beyond criminal courts, because we're thinking about police, we're thinking about prisons, we're not thinking about what's in the middle, which is also a criminalizing space that's, feeding people from one to the other, but also creating its own harms in the process. And so there's a lot there, both how you as legal workers, when you're in the criminal court system, be dismantling its power and building power for the people you're representing more, and then also about how do we dream something else, right? What's another way, like why do we need to adjudicate harm? How do we need to adjudicate harm? What's the investigatory function that we want to have in society? How do we want it to look? are there things that courts do that we don't need at all? And it's a real invitation to think about that. And I think that there are some law professors who are thinking about how to, and guild chapters who are thinking about how to bring that into the classroom. So if you want to do that, let me know. There's also a discussion guide for No More Police. I think you all are using it as part of the guild reading process, but if not, you should definitely check it out and use it in your classrooms, your study groups, and your families over dinner, over the summer, whatever. There's also a report that recently came out to just kind of really counter the notion that the movement to defund police is dead. It's far from dead. And the number of times people keep having to say, to declare it dead, is evidence that in fact it's not, because if something's dead, you don't have to keep saying it is. And so this sort of outlines how across the country, people are advancing abolitionist demands, building with each other around what, safety looks like, building with each other about how to navigate participatory budgeting and municipal budgeting processes, and figuring out what to do with American Rescue Plan Act dollars to keep them out of the hands of cops, and building relationships in community, doing participatory research and surveys and political education and people's assemblies and all kinds of ways of having conversations about what safety looks like. And then connecting with each other across the country to be in conversation. So there's sort of documentation about ongoing budget fights, how people are engaging in story collection, and then analyzing those stories or engaging members of the community as researchers. And then just looking forward, what people are thinking about in terms of the next phases of the struggle. It's not going to be 2020 all the time, but there are things we're doing in between times, in between 2020 and 2023, and then Cop City, and then the next thing, where we're deepening our capacity to respond to those moments of uprising, those moments of possibility to move the conversation forward in a more dramatic way. I know folks are fighting to get cops off campus. I hope you all are too, and definitely doing that in connection with folks across the country through groups like dissenters and other folks. Obviously, a lot of us are talking about criminalization of abortion and reproductive care, and also trans health care. And one thing that interrupting criminalization is doing is creating tools for movements to keep abortion safe and available and free, to connect those movements with folks who are already working on decriminalization and vice versa, and to engage healthcare providers in thinking about what their role is in criminalization, and also what their role could be in interrupting it. And obviously that includes continuing to provide gender affirming care and fighting like hell for trans youth's ability to access the care that they need and want, and to resist all the ways that legislators in this moment are trying to literally erase trans life in public. So that's just the quick snapshot of what we ran through in No More Police. I know you all will have questions and things you want to talk about. So I will stop there and turn it over to you for questions.
I know you couldn't hear that, but people were clapping.
Oh, I couldn't hear anything. I was just like, well, I don't know, maybe they're asleep, which I often was in law school. So,
Yeah. So I'm sure we will have some questions. Did we have any written down, or are people still kind of marinating and thinking? Okay, great. Let me grab those.
Should I come down? Oh, right. Okay, yes. Sorry.
We figured you probably wouldn't be able to hear people if they tried to yell it from the back of the room.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank the organizers, one, for inviting me, but also for doing it in doing everything in such a beautiful and thoughtful way to make sure that folks can see me, I can see them, that I can hear your questions, that I can receive them, that you can share them in the chat. I'm looking in the chat. I'm not seeing any here, but if there are some coming in that way, I'll definitely look at them as well.
Can you hear me if I stand right here?
Yes, I can. That's great.
Great. So we have a question. How does restorative justice fit into an abolitionist framework?
Such a good question. So restorative justice is a process where two individuals, come together when one has been harmed by the other, or a group of individuals come together and, address the harm, name the harm, address who's been impacted by it, what would be required to make it right, make amends, repair the harm between those individuals. And that's it. It's a very valuable process. I appreciate when I've been able to engage it from all sides as someone who's harmed and been harmed. And I think it's a really important process for dealing with conflict that you can't manage on your own, or that's serious, that requires that level of repair. It doesn't necessarily bring us closer to abolition, because it doesn't necessarily stop the next instance from happening. Because what transformative justice does, which is everything I just said, and it calls the community in to be like, well, how did we all contribute to the conditions that made this possible? And how do we transform the conditions that made this possible? So to give an example, I don't know, I did this one the other night in Seattle, like with my friend Angelica, who's also a law professor, but I was like, we might show up at our kids' school one day and both of us like fight over a parking spot, and it gets into a physical fighting match and we rip each other's hair out and whatever. Then we sit, the teachers, everybody sits us down, is like, kids can't be seeing that, like you can't do that. And the cops might have arrested one of us for assault, and then we decide, oh, we'll do a restorative justice process together instead. And we sit down and we say, like, hey, not cool to pull my hair out over a parking spot. Well, but we have back and forth. And we're like, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry I harmed you. That was harmful. I hear the impact on you. Yes, this was this, whatever. Everybody takes responsibility and we call it a day. That's restorative justice. Transformative justice is like everybody being like, well, why is there not enough parking at the school? And also, why are we having to drive to school? And also, why are we not having free childcare and support for parents, so they're not arriving at school frazzled because they just had to like do 10 million things to get their kids ready to school, and they can't be late for work or they're gonna get fired, or the babysitter didn't show up, and the blah blah, like all the things, right? How do we not have supports around parents so that dropping your kid off isn't like the most stressful part of the day? And then how do we also maybe do some training so that we learn to de-escalate ourselves and each other in moments like that? And what else? Like, there's a million things that we could do that incident points to as structural issues that are contributing to harm. Whereas if my friend and I just kind of have that restorative justice thing, it's important, and maybe we'll think more closely next time before we do something like that. But we're still fighting for parking spots every day at the school. We're still arriving frazzled because we don't have the resources we need, and we're still, internalizing stress and harming ourselves and possibly, the people around us. So that's, I think restorative justice has a place in teaching us skills and offering opportunities to deal with harm in individual instances, and abolition requires that we engage in transformative justice because we want to abolish the conditions that produce harm. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, I got a thumbs up. So next question. What are some ways that we can practice abolitionist values in our daily lives?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I just read a book about this. Like literally, like just submitted it yesterday. Like just press send. So I'm like, I don't know anymore. I don't even know what I said. I think it starts with you. It starts with us. It starts with us looking at even how we talk to ourselves. And I think sometimes that can be really punishing and policing. And then we wonder why that's what's happening in the world. Like, we've internalized it and we're reproducing it in ourselves. And then we are often reproducing it in our conversations and relationships with other people. And then in every environment we're in. So I think the first thing to do is to really pay attention to how do you talk to yourself and others, and how you think about what should happen when you make a mistake, when other people make a mistake, when you hurt yourself, when other people hurt yourself, when you're under stress. And then I think in our relationships, right, practicing dealing with conflict in generative ways, in the ways that I just described. So one, practicing taking accountability, right? And so being like, oh, I fucked up. I did this thing. I'm sorry. It hurt you. And I think it hurt you this way, but I'm interested in hearing how you felt it hurt you, and how I can repair that harm. And also inviting accountability, being like, really, that was not okay what happened there. So getting those skills, getting skills to de-escalate, getting skills to mediate, getting skills to help us all feel collectively stronger in navigating conflict and harm and need in ways that don't involve policing and punishment. And then kind of modeling those for people around us, teaching people around us, and just kind of shifting the culture or in that way. I think there's also about making sure people's material needs are met. Mutual aid is a huge piece of abolitionist work, because and fighting for housing from the state, or guaranteed income from the state, or other things that meet people's material needs from the state, because so much of what is deemed crime or criminalized is actually about, I didn't have diapers, I didn't have a place to live, I didn't have something I needed, and that something I needed might have been a controlled substance, but I still needed it and I didn't have it, right? And I didn't have a safe place to get it or use it. So much of what is named as crime or criminalized, and so much of what is harm and causes harm and violence, is about unmet needs. So identifying what those are and figuring out how to meet them with the people in your community, and how to make sure they're met for a broader number of people. And then I think one piece that we don't often practice is exercising our imagination. And, my friend Robin Maynard, who wrote that book, Policing Black Lives, I mentioned earlier about policing in Canada, plays a game with her son where they drive around, and wherever they see a cop, they're like, what else could be there? What else could be there? Could there be like a giant bouncy castle there instead of a police place? Like, could there be a park? Could there be, like, what else, or what is that function is that cop playing there? What else could we do? Or let me dream and imagine a world without police. And that's what we were doing. I mean, that Wakanda exercise I talked about was like a bunch of lawyers. Like, we're literally, our imaginations in law school are broken on purpose. And so it's about recapturing those. And if you go to the Beyond Courts website, there's an imagination section that has pieces of visionary fiction and invites you to sort of break down how harm is adjudicated and handled in those imaginary worlds. Someone once wrote a law review article about the law in the world of Harry Potter. Like, we want to look at our imagination and how other people are using their imagination to think about what is possible, what else could be possible. So I think those are some ways to practice abolition every day, in addition to fighting like hell to take power, money, legitimacy, and resources away from cops, police, prisons, surveillance, and borders. Just a few things.
Just a few, yeah. Thank you for that answer. That was really inspiring to hear you just talk about all of those ways. Even like that seems so simple. We can do that today.
I think it's important because, when Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, abolitionists change one thing, everything, I'm overwhelmed. I'm like, that's a lot to do. And maybe I just need to go Netflix now. And so I think it's important to bring it into the realm of like, let me just do one thing today that undermines policing and punishment. one thing every day.
So our next question, what does cop watching look like on a college campus?
I think it means having your phone out at all times and documenting whatever campus police are doing, and then publicizing it. And that could include, like, when they're doing nothing, because then they're clearly not doing anything to promote safety either. And I think it also means looking for other places where you see patterns of policing and punishment, right? So are there places where behavior is being policed in other ways? And then I think the thing about cop watching is that it requires kind of infrastructure around it, so that what you're documenting, one, you're not documenting stuff that's going to help get people in trouble. So let me tell you, if you see someone pulling down a statue or doing something that is going to be criminalized, please don't film them, and please do not post it on social media. Like, stop creating evidence for the cops, right? So keep the camera on the cops and what the cops are doing, not on what people are doing. But then if you are filming what someone is experiencing from policing, then you want to make sure that you're in relationship with them, and giving them the information that they need. So I think there's a lot of ways of making public what police do that helps us, like with those posters, make it clear to more and more people what cops are actually doing, which hopefully will bring more and more people into that first question I offered, which is they start to question the violence of policing, and then starts to bring more and more people into imagining what else is possible.
Thank you. Our next question, what are your thoughts on so-called progressive DAs?
No. Sorry.
The rest of the question, is it worth our time to volunteer or support their campaigns, or do you see it as more of the same in a slightly different shape?
See, my answer is still no. On the Beyond Courts website, there's a whole section on this, on the so-called progressive prosecutor. I can't even say it because it's an oxymoron. Also, y'all should know I'm a criminal defense attorney, so I'm biased and also right. But yeah, there's no way to be how are you a progressive prosecutor? Your job is to put people in cages. That's not progressive. I'm not trying to help you put people in cages. I don't care if that's the whole thing again about like mass incarceration, over policing. I'm not trying to help you figure out, how to get a just right amount of prosecution. Like, unless your campaign is to get into office in order to fully dismantle the office of the prosecution, then I might get behind you. But other than that, it's not. Nope.
Yeah.
Sorry. This is one where I'm very firm and not very generative in my response. But there's a lot more nuance and detail on the Beyond Courts website in the progressive prosecutor section.
Thank you. Okay, our next question. Can you speak to the connection between austerity politics and expanded police funding and tough on crime rhetoric? There is seemingly always more funding available for police, but never enough to directly address people's needs.
Exactly. That's literally it in a nutshell. I wrote a piece called Epicenter Chicago, Reclaiming a City from Neoliberalism, that traces the answer to the question that you just posed, because Chicago is a city where austerity politics and neoliberal economic policies originated from University of Chicago and were practiced in Chile and brought back and practiced around the world and through the World Bank and the IMF. And the idea is, yes, we take entitlements away from people. We get rid of the notion of a commons, of a common set of shared resources that we all have access to as we need and contribute to as we're able. And we shrink what is public and increase what is private and what you can buy if you have enough money. I even saw today, I was at the airport, and you can reserve a spot you can make an appointment for your TSA like screening. You can be like, I will come through TSA security at 10:55. But of course you have to pay for that, right? Like it's like literally like you can only get things you need through buying. And those politics immiserate a greater number of people. They produce what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, where because the public resources are shrinking because everything's being privatized and cut, then people who don't have things or can't buy the things are then criminalized for the things that they do to survive. And then they are framed as individuals who are inherently criminal, and neighborhoods and communities that are inherently criminal. And then that sends more cops into those places and gives the cops more justification. They're like, oh, well, there's so much more crime over here. You need to give us more money, which takes more money out of the public coffer into the cops and into the community and into policing of the community. It takes more people out of the community and into cages. And then there's even less earning power, less money, less resources in those communities. And it's a cycle. So I do think it's really important to make those connections, to recognize that it's not just that poverty is being criminalized, but it's a part of a cycle of creating poverty by concentrating resources and wealth, and then blaming individuals for structural problems and criminalizing them as a result. And it's just it's all of a piece. It's a project.
Absolutely. We had a request for you to stop screen sharing so that people could see you on this.
That's precisely why I'm going to keep screen sharing. Okay.
Oh, okay. And then we did have another question in the Zoom chat. It's kind of moving back toward the idea of a progressive prosecutor. And the question is, what if you belong to a department within the prosecutor's office dedicated to prosecuting police officers? Can that be progressive?
Good question. No. And the answer there is that we can't legitimize the system we're trying to tear down as we're trying to tear it down, right? And so the notion that we can turn to the system that makes police violence possible, and not only makes it possible, but demands it, to then get justice or repair or reparation when it happens is ridiculous. So I think that those sections of those offices are put up to build legitimacy for the police and for the police department, to say, look, if there are bad guys, we'll get them. And then every once in a while they sacrifice one to make it look like they're getting the bad guys. They're like, oh, look, we put Chauvin away. See, we're good. The system works. Literally, Reverend Al Sharpton said, look, see, the system works because we put one bad guy away. That didn't stop the cops who killed Tyree Nichols from killing him. And, those cops going away isn't going to stop the cops killing the next person, right? And also the number of police prosecutions that happen amounts to like basically 1% of police killings. Well, the number of prosecutions is 10% of police killings, and the number of convictions is 1%. So that is literally window dressing. It's literally like, make it look like something's happening. And the people who I work with most often it's never going to be a prosecution. And I've heard cops say that, right? Cops sexually assault people in the sex trade, and then the prosecutor's like, yeah, sure, but who's going to believe her? So I'm sure it's terrible, but I can't bring this in front of a jury, right? And so it's also a particular kind of police violence that gets prosecuted, and the everyday violence of policing, which is much, much, much broader, does not. And then, what happens with prosecutions? One cop goes behind bars and then is also experiencing violence. So have I stopped violence? No. And so I think that there's, and just so you know, this was my last holdout. I was like, absolutely abolition, everything, but why can't we prosecute cops? And I was organized to this around this by Rachel Hertzing from Critical Resistance, who was just like, we cannot feed the system that we're trying to tear down. This means there's no consequences. They should lose their jobs. They should never be able to work in law enforcement again. In Chicago, there was a whole campaign for reparations for survivors. They should have to make reparations for survivors of police violence, but there's no, and reparations includes stopping the thing that caused the harm. So it's not like, and in some ways, abolition is the ultimate accountability, is the ultimate police accountability and the most effective police accountability. So I think for me, stopping someone from being able to have the position of continuing to do that work or that violence, and also making it so that no one else is going to be in the position to do that violence, is actually the only way that we're going to stop it, not by sort of trying to pick one off at a time and mostly not be successful. Sorry. No prosecutors.
Thank you. Yes, the person who asked that question said, thank you, that 1% even seems high.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And we have another question in the Zoom chat. And the question is, police aren't the answer, but how do we address the rise of fascism without involving existing systems?
Well, existing systems are part of the rise of fascism. So that's thing one, right? The cops and Klan go hand in hand is not just a slogan. Like, they are advancing fascism. They are part of advancing fascism. They're not stopping fascism. So, and nor is the government, frankly. So the government, I say that, broadly, but I mean current governments. So I think we press people in power to take a stand, to stand against fascism, to resist fascism, to make the conditions that fuel fascism not possible. But I just want to caution that doesn't mean that we then, demand more terrorism charges against white supremacists or Nazis, because what happens when we demand more terrorism charges is that forest offenders get the terrorism charges, never the Nazis, never the Klan. Or if they do, it's like cops, it's like 1% just to make it look like something's happening, while the rest of them go, completely free to operate. So I think resisting fascism, I hate to say this, there's actually a really good book that I think everyone should read that just came out called No Pasaran, edited by Shane Burley, but it talks about the best way to fight fascism is by building strong communities. And that's how fascists are working, is they're building strong communities. They're working at the level of relationship and connection and, changing people's worldviews and ideas by meeting their material needs and then having conversations with them at church dinners, at, revival meetings, at when they came over to help them build their barn, when they, whatever, like in whatever space they are. The way I just said, practice abolition every day, they're practicing fascism every day. And so we need to be contesting for power and kind of worldviews and visions of the future in our everyday relationships and in our families and at the dinner table and with our friends and with our larger communities and in the streets and in our institutions. Like, the fascists are coming to take the books away from then we're at the school meeting saying, no, that's not going to happen. The fascists are saying no drag shows. We're saying absolutely there's going to be drag shows and more of them. And we will be here to make sure that happens. Like, that's how we fight fascism. We don't fight fascism by giving more power to the state to turn against us, which is kind of what happens when we think that they're going to be the answer.
Thank you for that answer. Do we have any more questions from the room here? No? Okay. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions so thoughtfully. I know we wanted to do a giveaway of your book, of Andrea's.
Ooh. Amazing.
We have 5 copies. They're not here physically, but they will be very
Hmm.
soon. So I would like to invite one of my co-directors up.
I think that will wrap up, and so I.
Okay, great. So we're gonna wrap up the Zoom to put up the other computer for the drawing.
Wait,
But
does that mean that people on the Zoom don't get to be in the drawing?
well, the idea was to encourage in-person participation.
Oh, I see. Sorry, folks. Well, if anyone on the Zoom wants to enter into a raffle, just drop your email in the chat. Oh, some folks already have 2 copies. Okay, well, drop your email in the chat and I will make sure that you get a copy if you don't already have one and you don't have access to one in your library or somewhere else. But appreciate that you're giving it away in this space, and we want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to engage with it. There's also lots of excerpts. If you go to the Interrupting Criminalization website and go under publications, there's a whole page for No More Police, and you can read probably the important bits online for free if you go to the excerpts. So you can check that out as well. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all these great questions. Y'all are brilliant. I'm so excited for what your chapter does in the future on campus and beyond. And just as long as you don't work in a prosecutor's office, feel free to reach out anytime. And even if you do, so that if we can think about ways we can be building together, I'm really excited about that. I'm sorry again, I couldn't be there in person, but I'm so grateful to be able to be in conversation with y'all. And thank you so much to the organizers for making it possible.
Great. I'm gonna unplug the laptop from the thing, but yeah. Bye.